In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
The parable this morning is fairly short and simple. There is a father and two sons. And when the father tells his sons that it's time to get up and go to work in the family vineyard, one of the sons, the family rebel, tells his father he can go drop dead. And then, after a while, he has a change of heart, and he gets up and he goes to work in the vineyard. The other son, who is the goody two-shoes in the family, when his father tells him it's time to get up and go to work in the family vineyard, he immediately, cheerfully chirps, "Yes, sir, yes, sir, 3 bags full." But he never actually gets up and goes to work. And that's the end of the parable. Now, the obvious difference between the two sons is that one of them eventually obeys his father, and the other one doesn't. Just slightly less obvious than that is that one of the sons has a change of heart, and the other one doesn't. In the beginning, the rebel sincerely despises his father. And then in the end, he sincerely honors his father. The outwardly compliant son isn't exactly the opposite of that. It's not as if in the beginning he sincerely honors his father and then later on he reverses himself. In the beginning he pays his father lip service. But from beginning to end he has no real interest in his father or his father's wishes. Now, I don't know if you can recognize either of those characters from your own experience, or your own family, or your own self. But I wonder if you can recognize those two characters from another parable. If you think about it, the parable this morning is just a stripped-down version of the prodigal son. Okay, the parable of the prodigal son is way longer than this one and much more colorful, and it's full of details and dialogue and drama nowhere to be found in this morning's parable. But if you strip off all the color, the parable of the prodigal son basically boils down to the story of a father and two sons, one of whom is a rebel who has no interest in working on the family farm and who tells his father, "Drop dead." And then later, after some drama, has a change of heart, and he returns to his father, sincerely pledging his obedience. While the other brother in that parable, the compliant one, is left at the end of the parable estranged from his father, angry at his father, totally bewildered by his father's willingness to take the rebel back. Okay, they are not exactly the same parable. But both parables represent the same thing. In each parable, each of the two sons represents a group of real live people in Israel. And both parables are representing the same two groups. In each parable, the rebel represents the prostitutes and the tax collectors, the terrible sinners. And in each parable, the other son, the compliant or the apparently compliant son, represents the religious authorities. And it's to the religious authorities that both parables are told. Okay, here is the difference. The parable of the prodigal son is told with a real sympathy for the religious authorities. It's told in response to a question the religious authorities ask. And here's their question. "Jesus, why do you eat and drink with prostitutes and tax collectors? Don't you know who they are? Don't you know what they do? Don't you know that these are the people who tell God he can go drop dead?" The parable of the prodigal son is the answer to that question. That's why the parable is so long, because it takes the question so seriously. The bulk of the details and the dialogue and the drama in the parable vividly describe the rebel's sinfulness, selfishness, stubbornness, wantonness, and depravity. The parable is a faithful representation of what the religious authorities see when they look at the prostitutes and the tax collectors. And Jesus is telling the religious authorities, I know what you see when you look at them. And I see it too. I know who they are. I know what they do, and I know what they do is awful. I am not eating and drinking with them because I think you're wrong about them. I actually think you're right about them. The only thing you're wrong about is God. When God looks at them, he sees everything that you see. And he also sees the sheep of his own flock who have gone astray. And he wants to save them. And he wants to change their hearts. And that's why I eat and drink with them. I eat and drink with them to change their hearts. And you know what? Their hearts are changing. Right before your eyes. You shouldn't be complaining. You should be rejoicing. These are your brothers and sisters who were lost. And now they're found. So, my very religious brothers, won't you change your hearts? And that's the end of the parable. At the end of the parable, the other brother is left standing outside his father's house, sincerely angry, sincerely bewildered. And he's left with a sincere invitation to come inside the house and join the party. Okay. Can you see that that parable is told with a serious appreciation for the question and a sincere sympathy for the people who ask it? That sympathy is nowhere to be found in this morning's parable. In this parable, the son who represents the religious authorities is simply represented as totally insincere. And that's in part because this parable is answering a different question. This time, the question is, Jesus, by what authority do you do the things you do? To which Jesus first replies by saying, I will tell you by what authority I do the things I do, if you will tell me by what authority did John the Baptist do the things he did. Which turns out to be a question the religious authorities aren't willing to answer. And it's at that point in the dialogue that the root of the difference between the two parables is exposed. The real difference is this. When the religious authorities ask Jesus, Jesus, how can you eat and drink with those people? The question is sincere. They are sincerely bewildered by Jesus' behavior. But when the religious authorities ask Jesus, by what authority do you do the things you do? The question is insincere. And you can tell how insincere it is by the dialogue that follows. No sooner does Jesus tell him by what authority John did the things he did, that the religious authorities lose all interest in their own question. If they ever actually had any real interest in the answer to their question, if their question was ever meant to do anything other than confirm a conclusion they'd already reached, they are now completely preoccupied by something else. If they grant that John the Baptist was actually a prophet of God, they see, then Jesus is going to ask them why they never responded to John the Baptist, like, for instance, all the sinners did. But if they deny that John the Baptist was a prophet of God, they see, then the crowds who are eavesdropping on this exchange are immediately going to pillory the authorities for failing to recognize a prophet. Okay, in either case, the authorities are going to be publicly embarrassed. In either case, they're going to lose face. In either case, they're going to lose authority. And that's where their interest really lies, in defending their own authority. That's what lies behind their question. That's why Jesus denies them a direct answer. They're not really honestly interested in the answer to their question. They're not really interested in the authority of Jesus any more than they were ever really interested in the authority of John, because they have never really been interested in the authority of God. All they're really interested in is preserving their own. And that's an interest in which Jesus takes no interest. And that's why he goes on then to tell the parable which treats them with no sympathy. Okay, the issue is not that they are questioning Jesus. It's not even that they're questioning his authority. The Bible is full of men and women who question God. Sometimes bewilderedly, sometimes angrily. And God never fails to honor the question or the questioner. Even hostile questions do not throw God on the defensive. If the cross has taught us nothing else about God, it should at least have taught us that God doesn't get defensive. Even when his own children tell him that he can go drop dead, God doesn't get defensive. When his own children tell God to go drop dead, God replies, "Yes, sir, yes, sir." 3 bags full. And then he picks up a cross and he goes to work. God does not object to our hard questions. He doesn't hide from our questions. But there is a kind of question we sometimes ask because we're hiding. Not the kind of question that is actually seeking an honest answer, but which is really only interested in proving a point, or defending an agenda, or delaying a decision, or evading an issue. Do you know the kind of question I'm talking about? It's the kind of question I sometimes raise myself. When somebody gives me an invitation, I'm really not interested in accepting. And I'm not interested enough to say yes. And I'm not honest enough to say no. Okay. There are probably any number of ways we could apply that to ourselves today. Here is one way we can apply it to ourselves this morning. This morning, we are baptizing children. And one way to think about what baptism is, it is God saying yes to a child and welcoming that child into his own household. Another way to think about baptism is to think of it as a gift of grace, which initiates a change of heart, so that the child one day can sincerely say yes to God. Meanwhile, all the rest of us, all the baptized, are saying yes to our own baptisms, in part by answering a series of questions, most of which have to do with authority. And whether or not you and I are willing to admit God's authority in our lives, or whether we admit somebody else's authority in our lives, or whether we just prefer to defend our own. There's only 2 ways I know to answer those questions: sincerely or insincerely. Spiritual growth does not begin with our repeating the correct answers. Spiritual growth begins with our giving honest